Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gloria Blackwell, Senior Vice President of Fellowships and Programs at AAUW, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, To Fulfill These Rights, a conversation on equity and education with Dr. Amaka Okechukwu. We're very excited that you're here today, and we're going to have a really great conversation. So let's get started. Uh, Around us, everyone is seeing a great deal of activism. And activism certainly isn't something new or something that went away. Um, it really had its roots firmly on our college campuses, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And unfortunately, those same types of issues we're still looking for and addressing solutions for today. Back then, like now, Black and Latinx students on college campuses were really the ones who were protesting for more representation, for a less hostile campus. And we know that these are still issues that are certainly on the docket today. Um, and still, we see that affirmative action has become a lightning rod of controversy, has been the recipient of a lot of conservative backlash. And certainly, so many efforts have been made to dismantle it over the years. Uh, and then we're also faced with COVID-19, which had a tremendous impact on this past semester, as well as the upcoming fall admissions for students across our country and across the world. Um, Last year's admissions scandal certainly brought to light another inequity that we see in higher education as people entered into a pay to play scenario when it came to higher education. So today, I'm really pleased that Dr. Okechukwu is here with us to talk about equity in higher education and focusing on her book, To Fulfill These Rights, the political struggle over affirmative action and open admissions. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. She is one of our amazing AAUW Fellowship and Grant recipients. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who's engaged in research on social movements, race, community studies, public history, and Black archives. Her book, To Fulfill These Rights, Political Struggle Over Affirmative Action and Open Admissions, was actually just published last year by the Columbia University Press. And congratulations, Dr. Okechukwu, on the publishing of your book. And she currently serves as an assistant professor of sociology at George Mason University in Virginia. Dr. Okechukwu has also worked as an oral historian, an archivist, and researcher at the Weeksville Heritage Center and the Brooklyn Historical Society. So we'll have a conversation about her book and her research and the topic at hand. And then, as I mentioned, we will take a look at the questions that you have presented before us. But before we get started, Amaka, I'd like to ask you if you could just give us kind of an overview of your book to get us started.
Of course. First, thank you, Gloria, for organizing this conversation and for everyone that's tuned in today. I appreciate you tuning in and your interest in my work. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. I do want to say a few things just about the book, just to give you a sense, give the audience a sense of the book. This book is about the very public struggles waged over affirmative action and open admissions in public universities. So specifically, I focus on affirmative action policies implemented and rolled back at the University of California, University of Michigan, University of Texas, Austin, and I'll look at open admissions in the senior colleges of the City University of New York system, so CUNY. I selected these institutions and these policies because, for one, in the affirmative action cases, these were public battles that had enormous impact on the field of higher education, concerned with public elite institutions. And the CUNY case is important because it is a working class, more inclusive institution that still experienced retrenchment of access policies led by some of the same forces involved in affirmative action backlash. And so together, the cases provide a sense of how race and class access policies have been shaped and attacked across the field of higher education at both elite spaces as well as more working class accessible spaces. I trace the adoption of these policies in the 1960s and 1970s and attacks on these policies in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so I argue that the various social actors that are engaged in political struggle here define, challenge, and transform racial practices and ideas with particular focus on the racial logics of color blindness and diversity, right, which emerge in various campaigns and political struggles concerning these policies. It is not an optimistic book. It deals with the very real impact of conservative legal mobilization and the impact of that on the political landscape. And this is even before Trump, right? And so with the Trump presidency, we are in more constrained circumstances in some ways, but we can talk about that. But it's important because it draws attention to grassroots and elite mobilization on the left and the right, and shows how the concepts of colorblindness and diversity have been legally developed and have had impacts on the greater field of race and class politics. I always mention what my book does not do as a means of clarifying my intervention. And so this is not a traditional higher education book in that it's not focused on the statistical assessment of, retention and matriculation rates, college readiness. It does not consider where students go once the policies have been ended. There's really excellent work that does this that I do cite in the book. It does not engage in debates on whether, what the merits to affirmative action are or try to convince opponents otherwise. It's really about racial politics, social movements, and how people construct and deploy race politically. And so that's how I sort of, that would be a kind of overview. The book ended before the most recent case, which was the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case. Though the book can still be useful for analyzing that case because Edward Bloom, who's the legal strategist behind the case, was also behind the Fisher versus Texas cases, which are in the book. The political landscape has also changed a lot, right, since the election of Trump. So we have a further rightward movement of the Supreme Court, right, this current revolt against police terror, right, that we're experiencing right now, along with the experience of the pandemic. I also recently heard that in California, there are currently efforts to undo Prop 209. Proposition 209 is what the proposition that terminated affirmative action throughout the state of California in 1996. And so I believe as of yesterday, they're trying to place resolutions back on the state constitution to repeal that and to reinstitute affirmative action. So there's, that conversation is being had in California. And then, with this current movement led by the Movement for Black Lives, there have been larger conversations being had about racism, which has also impacted the academy. So for those of you on social media, right, hashtag Black in the Ivory Tower, hashtag shut down academia, right? These are some conversations that have emerged over the last week or so that have really been trying to take the academy to task for the racism that persists in academic spaces, right? So these are important things to think about. I think also because my book really ends before the Trump era, this is really dealing with a period of conservatism that is focused on colorblindness, right? So kind of a racial coding that signals both an abandonment of civil rights reform while aiming to adopt the language, right, of the civil rights movement as a means of political incorporation. And that, I think, in some ways is in contrast to what we see now, which is just more blatant racist rhetoric, political rhetoric that we see on a daily basis in political speech and different kinds of political dialogue. And so that's an important difference, though I do caution a return, right? A lot of folks in experiencing how awful this period has been are, wishing for the past. And I caution that because, part of my point here is that right? This racism has been persistent, but it shows up in different ways. I think we should see it on a spectrum, right? And this, this entire spectrum is still sort of oriented to sort of dismantle
Right.
civil rights reform, progressive reform, et cetera. And then I guess, one of the last things I'll say before we start the questions is, with this period of COVID-19 and the movement against police terror right now has really laid bare racial stratification in this country in ways that those of us that live it and study it have recognized this forever, right? But these crises have really laid bare, right, racial stratification and the kinds of political priorities in this country. And so I think there's particular connections in thinking about the sort of racial landscape during this particular moment, both with thinking about the role of white women, right? So this example of the Central Park situation a few weeks back, right? Everybody was talking about. I talk about the role of sort of white female plaintiffs in the Supreme Court cases against affirmative action, and how conservative strategists really sort of deployed white women in a particular way through these court struggles as a means to sort of communicate a kind of gendered vulnerability, to kind of show that there are victims to affirmative action. So, I think that's an important thing to think about in this present period. I think that in thinking about both sort of visual rhetoric and the visual signaling of diversity, even in this moment, what we will see lots of folks of color spokespersons on the right probably being trotted out to still sort of protect the interests of privilege in this period. I talk about that in my book in regards to the role of people of color spokespersons in being at the forefront of ending affirmative action. So that's something to look for as well. And then I think that this moment also shows us really the necessity to consider more radical possibilities, right? When it comes to police violence in this period, right, defunding the police is on the table. I never in my lifetime would have thought that sort of language that comes from abolitionists would be on a national stage right now. And so if if this could be on the table for policing, this means that we can think about radical interventions for higher education as well, right? And so we can talk more about that. But really questioning sort of power and the way their resources are distributed in these institutions, I think that we can sort of radically intervene in this field as well. So I'll say that, and then we can get into the questions.
Thank you so much, Amaka. That's a lot, and I think the framing is exactly what we're looking for, so that sort of people understand the context of where you were at the time that the research was done, and making that connection to kind of sort of where we are now. So yeah, we'll jump right into the conversation. People have a lot of misconceptions about what affirmative action actually is and who benefits, right? So if you could share sort of what are some of the common misconceptions, and sort of, why not take legacy admissions or the admissions of, big donors into account? There's such a focus on affirmative action.
Right. So that's a really important question, I think, to begin with. And I think the first thing that I'll do is sort of clarify what I mean by affirmative action. Um, and in any conversation, right, we should be clear about how people are using the terms that they're using. So affirmative action typically refers to programs or policies that provide special consideration to historically excluded groups, right? I'm focusing specifically on admissions decisions in higher education. So the historically excluded groups here are typically Black, Latinx, and Native American students. So those are the students that affirmative action tends to benefit. It is implemented through holistic review in university admissions. This is very important. Holistic review means that it's considered in the context of the entire applicant file. So this means it's not included through points, through grids, through mechanical means, right? All of those, the points, grids, and any other mechanical means have been constructed as quotas. Affirmative action can also, beyond admissions, can also be used to describe outreach programs, targeted recruitment, scholarships and financial aid, any variety of retention and matriculation programs, any programs that may support the advancement of advanced or the sort of attainment of advanced degrees. So it can refer to a sort of wide range of activities. However, the really important piece here is that affirmative action almost exclusively operates at selective public and private institutions, right? What this means is that the sheer majority of colleges, of institutions of higher education in this country do not implement affirmative action. The majority of them do not, but the selective institutions do, right? So that's an important clarification, because I do think it's a myth that affirmative action is everywhere. It is only at elite selective institutions. So that's a really important piece. I think that a lot of people think that affirmative action is a quota program. Quotas have been illegal in affirmative action since 1978. And so the ways in which universities are implementing affirmative action today do not include quotas, right? It's holistic review is the language that is used, and it's, again, just with considering applicant's background in relationship to the entire applicant file. So that's how I would begin to answer that question. I think that, part of why it was important for me to also include open admissions in the book was because, really focusing on the ways that affirmative action only operated at elite institutions only really tells you just a small part, right, about access in higher education, because most institutions are not elite or selective. And so for me, looking at open admissions in the CUNY system was important to be able to capture a wider sense of the field of higher education and the ways in which there were threats to both, affirmative action in elite spaces as well as open admissions in a more accessible space. Okay. So yeah, so that's how I would answer that. I think that the second part to your question about legacy admissions or the admissions of donors is an important one. I don't think that, I think that we should absolutely consider the role of legacy admissions and the sort of admission of children of donors. The reasons why conservatives do not focus on that is because they're not truly interested in, access. They're not interested in, this question of discrimination. They're not really interested in sort of maintaining these spaces as inclusive spaces, because if they were, they would be concerned about the way that wealth structures the admissions classes of selected institutions. But they're not, which is why they attack affirmative action, because it's really about the symbolic work that affirmative action does. It's not even about the sort of very real impact of, people being in classrooms. It's about, what does this represent to this country, and that we need to get rid of what this represents, right? So this is very much, it's the reason why affirmative action and attacks to affirmative action really emerged during this period of the culture wars in the 90s, because this really is about the sort of symbolic work that affirmative action does.
Great, thank you. And I think the word access is key, throughout the conversation, because it really is about access and who's worthy of access. And if you're not really focusing on access, then those are also reasons why legacy and donors, those things just don't come up as much, because certain people really aren't interested in broadening access. And so talk a little bit about the impact or the presentation of Black and Latinx students and how they contributed to the development of affirmative action, that piece around campus-led protests, and how students were really key to the equity movement. We talk about one of the ways that AAUW, as an advocacy organization, seeks to, even in small ways, get people involved. For example, it's through our 2-minute activists, where you can, go online, you can send a message, to your representative in Congress, and, the ways in which, activism by Black and Latinx students, really help propel the issue.
So yeah, that's a great question. And it's really important to understand about affirmative action in particular that it's developed in a kind of piecemeal process. Affirmative action really emerges in universities in sort of two ways. One, in response to the Civil Rights Act and provisions in the Civil Rights Act, which are about protecting, um, you know, uh, preventing discrimination in federally funded institutions. So that's one piece. But the other piece is that in northern, um, mostly northern elite institutions, you have liberal administrators that sort of develop experimental programs that bring very small numbers of mostly Black students onto campuses, and in some cases, Latinx and other non-white ethnicities as well. These are very small numbers, so less, in some cases it's less than 50, students on campus. And these are experimental programs that emerge in concert with foundations as a means to sort of think about how um, how to sort of enact these questions around equity on campuses, on white campuses during the civil rights movement, right? And so the conditions are important to understanding why they would enact these experimental programs. But once you get small groups of students of color on campus, these are students that are central to demanding more. They are central to, demanding more aggressive policies. They're central to connecting campus concerns to larger community concerns, right, during the civil rights movement. These are students that lead strikes and protests, marches, sit-ins on campuses. And as a result, on the campuses that I focus on, we have the implementation of more aggressive policies. A lot of these more aggressive policies are, they're certainly complicated, but they are sort of, these are the policies that end up being either challenged by the Bach decision or, there might be a sort of small window where we begin to see more increase of these students on campus and more programs to keep them on campus. But these are often the programs that, suffer attacks later on. But part of why I sort of talk about students in relationship to the implementation of affirmative action is because it's a story that I did not see that frequently when researching and thinking about and talking about affirmative action, that it was solely this sort of top-down policy intervention when it really, in some ways, is a campus by campus design because of the ways in which the laws were very unspecific. There weren't really accountability structures built in from the beginning. And so we have a situation where campuses are implementing different kinds of policies. Baki sort of requires a little bit more cohesion. And then later on, we can begin to have more cohesive policies. But students are central to the ways in which these policies are enacted on their campuses. Students are at the forefront of questions around race access, equity, power, conversations about, town and gown relations. Students are central. Black students and Latinx students on some campuses are really central, right, to this. So I think they're an important part of the story.
Great. We talked a little bit earlier just about the issue around affirmative action, backlash, particularly around the conservative arm, of our political as well as the social fabric of our country. And so there's been a lot of obvious proof that there has been pushback against affirmative action, obviously things like Title IX. So as far as affirmative action is concerned, I mean, what do you think? You think it's possible to sort of maintain some stability or protection for the law?
That's a good question. Part of what I show in the book is that affirmative action has always been quite unstable. from the beginning. And I think that in terms of maintaining stability, I guess there's two ways into that. One, as I mentioned earlier, right, we have the example of California currently considering the repeal of Proposition 209. So that shows us that, even through past legislation, there are efforts, in ways that you have to engage your local representatives. There are ways to repeal things that have been passed, right? Even ones that are written into the Constitution, like Proposition 209 is in California. So that's one thing to consider. But I do think that, it really requires us to think about different ways to protect access, right? I'm all for supporting affirmative action, but I also do see this sort of the impact of the attack on affirmative action. So one of the things that I point out in the book is that, affirmative action still exists, but the ways that it's been gutted means that its impact is not what it used to be, right? Legally, affirmative action is still legal, right? The court's position currently is that diversity is a compelling state interest. And so you can implement ways to maintain or build diverse classes because it's a compelling state interest. However, they have constrained the methods by which you can attain that diversity, right? Very strict. The methods are almost to the point of being colorblind, right? And so this is what has come out over these many, many different Supreme Court cases. And so I think, because, one, affirmative action, again, is only impacting a very small, portion of universities. With that small portion of universities, I think they should fight to keep it. But I do think that this requires us to think more broadly about what is access, right? With higher education, we can think about the different ways that universities, research institutes, think tanks have been thinking of ways to enact. How do we consider the sort of geographical background of where the person lives, the type of high school that they went to, right? The other ways to sort of approximate the impact of racial identity, maybe poverty, right? All of these different factors. And so I think that's important to think about policies that can do that. But I also think it's really necessary to think about it more broadly, right? In higher education and beyond, right? It's hard for us to talk about higher education without thinking about K through 12 and in the sort of school systems that students are coming from that are either preparing them to go into college or not preparing them to go into college, right? You have to think about the purpose of higher education, right? I think this is a period of deep reimagining that we can do, right? Is it to, produce a workforce? And if so, what does that mean in a period of increasing, increasing sort of specialization of particular knowledges and labor, in a period of more automation, right? What does it mean if producing a workforce is the purpose of education? Might there be other purposes for education, and thus what would that look like, and what would it mean to make sure that this is a diverse and accepting and inclusive space? And so I think, I'm not saying to give up on affirmative action. I do think that we need to defend it, but I think we also need to think more broadly about access beyond just the elite spaces as a means to really meet the experience of most people and most folks of color in this country.
Great, thanks. And you touched upon this a bit earlier in your introduction when you're talking about your book, right? And so you're talking about you did an analysis sort of also focused around the politics in higher education. But if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the importance of the understanding of race and class in the U.S. and that connection to the higher ed piece, or you think you covered that earlier?
I think that, I mean, I've talked a little bit about it, but I do think, a perspective or a framework that considers race and class experiences is one that I use in my book, as a means to really sort of unpack, again, both access to higher education and the history of access to higher education. So, sort of, to give the sort of short, history lesson for folks, if we think about public institutions in this country, public colleges and universities, and the expansion of public colleges and universities happening in the post-war period, really in response to, one, we're still in a period of a welfare state where the state is making investments in the public sector for the good of, the citizens, but also, this is a period where people are coming out of war. The GI Bill is one that offers access to higher education for returning GIs, and campuses emerge to sort of meet the higher demand for higher education. This is a time period moving into a post-industrial economy where more credentialing is required for the kinds of jobs that are now available beyond a factory during the previous period. And so we look at the sort of increasing important role of colleges and universities in this country. This is at the same time at which Black people are organizing for citizenship rights, right? We, Black people in this country, are discriminated against in every aspect of their life. And while this sort of field of higher education is opening up for the rest of, for largely for white men, but, white people, Black people are not having the same access to opportunity during this time period. And so when we reflect back on the civil rights movement and consider the ways that education and demands for higher education access, or education access more broadly, has been so central, right? You think about Brown versus Board of Education being this, this landmark legislation. This is in relationship to schools, right? In which this is this particular battle is waged. And so, considering these things, it's really important to think about both race and class when it comes to access to higher education. Um, the open admissions policy that I focus on at CUNY is fought for by Black and Puerto Rican students in the CUNY system, but it's a policy that benefits everyone. It's not a race-specific policy. It's a quote-unquote colorblind policy. It's a working class policy, and it really allows further access for poor and working class people to attend college in New York City. And so for me, it's really important to think about the different ways that these different movements that have been shaped by these concerns, and the ways that these movements have worked to democratize, in some ways, higher education. It's really important for me to really put race and class at the forefront, and to also think about some of these race conscious policies as also class conscious, right? Particularly as when they're being passed. This is not about necessarily opening up space for Black elites. This is about these are demands that come out of movements, and about sort of opening up these spaces for everyone. So, so yeah, that's how I would answer that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks. And we talked a little bit in the beginning, just about, obviously COVID-19 is the everyday presence for all of us, and the impact that it's had, on our economy and on families, particularly low income families and communities. Do you have any thoughts about how institutions might provide some kind of support or apparatus to low income families who are, who hope their children will achieve a higher education?
Mhm. I think this is back again to this moment of reimagining these institutions. I think that we need to see
Mhm.
more federal and state investment in institutions
Mhm.
of all types, so that students, low income students in particular, but students generally should not be they shouldn't have to be concerned about debt when it comes to education. And I think particularly during this moment where people are economically constrained, I don't think that people should be really concerned about that. I think that we really need to think about I know Bernie Sanders is, he's not the nominee, but this was placed on the table, right, in regards to thinking about free college, thinking about eliminating student debt, right? These are things that would really widen access for everybody, in particular, low-income students who, could benefit from the experience of being in some of these institutions. And so, yeah, I mean, that would be my answer. Suspend, tuition, eliminate debt, right? These are things that would, absolutely shape the experiences of marginalized folk right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks. Um, and one of the things that we have also been seeing, particularly around admissions, is the shift towards early decision and early action. I just went through it with my youngest daughter, who just completed her freshman year. Those are things that really favor better resourced families, right?
Mm-hmm.
But institutions are also looking at, eliminating things like SATs, as well as, not favoring students who've made campus visits, right? So there are all of these other pieces that go along with equity, whether it's, SATs, or whether it's, did you make a campus visit, or, do you have the capacity, right, to have everything together to apply for early decision or early action? So what are some other ways that academic institutions can, make sure that we're really trying to move towards ensuring equity, particularly during COVID-19 when things are disrupted?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I am certainly in support of policies such as dropping standardized testing. Though, again, I think that as critical people, we need to understand that oftentimes some of this language around we're dropping test scores just means that there's another test being designed internally to be used on campus, and it's not like a nationwide test, right? There's still oftentimes a kind of numerical assessment that's being applied to the application. So it's not as if this is completely disappearing. So we have to really look at what the universities are actually doing in response to dropping testing, for example. But I'm absolutely in support of dropping standardized testing, eliminating early decision. And again, I think right now this question around tuition and debt is, I just keep coming back to that because this is really the biggest concern that most people are really considering right now and making decisions about where to even go. I mean, let's say that you do get into an elite space. If you're not getting your tuition covered, you're probably going to pick the less elite space because they may provide you some funding to go there. And so, we really have to deal with this question of the enormous cost of higher education in the present day. So I think we can start there, and then we can think more about questions around how people get into the door. And I talk a bit about this in the book, right? Ways in which that universities that were legally forced to end affirmative action, how they've been able to find ways to still admit Black and Brown students without sort of being able to consider race explicitly, right? Variety of different policies, lots of different programs where you're in communities from when they're, in kindergarten, kind of follow them all the way. Lots of different recruitment interventions. So, there's some discussion of that in the book, but I would definitely start with eliminating debt and, canceling tuition.
Right. And, AAUW has done some really good work around student debt, which, this is not only the racial factor, but clearly, the gender factor, where women are holding on to 2/3 of the student debt, and the impact that has, as it follows you as you're, trying to have a career, and have a life, and the things that student debt have such an impact on. That's a really important point. People, it touches your decisions on the front end, and clearly has an impact on the back end.
Absolutely.
And we hear it from our fellows and grantees as well. The importance of just funding and the negotiating that needs to be done on campuses to pull together all of these different pieces to have a decision about, can I afford to come here? And what broader impact is that going to have on like every aspect of my life, for sure. Um, so before we jump into some of the questions, I know that you're working on a new book and some new research. If you wouldn't mind sharing it with us.
Absolutely. I'm in the early stages of working on my next book, which is a very different project in a sense. I'm basically examining Central Brooklyn in the 1970s and 1980s during the urban crisis. And I'm looking at the ways in which Black communities sort of came together to build institutions and meet their needs in response to the kind of municipal, state, and federal abandonment and neglect during that period. So, what are ways that community members tried to build, structures of safety for themselves when they could not depend on the police to come and protect their communities? How did people build? What are the kinds of cultural production coming out of these neighborhoods? How did it connect to, organizing around housing and other issues. So I'm still early in the stages. I'm focused on the neighborhoods of Crown Heights and Bedford Stuyvesant. And it's a historical project. I'm really excited about it, hoping to get back to some of these archives once the travel restrictions lift. But yeah, it's definitely a different project, but I'm still interested in the ways that people come together, right? Collective action, and how people sort of, meet their needs in the midst of different forms of neglect and abandonment.
Right, absolutely. Okay, I know that everyone has been waiting really patiently for us to get to some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A box. We definitely won't be able to get to all of the questions. Nakia, have you selected some of the questions that you would like for Dr. Okechukwu to respond to? Or Amaka, if you're looking at them, are there some that you just wanted to pick out?
Right. So I can start with some, and hopefully I'm capturing all the questions here, and I'll, just sort of go through some of them. So the first question I see is from Cheryl Perkins that asks, is there really color blindness? Perhaps it would be useful to ask for your definition of color blindness. So thank you for that question. Part of what I do in the book is really talk about color blindness as a kind of social construction and how it's being deployed in political struggle. So when in the contemporary period, when people are referring to, or in particularly the period of the book, when people are referring to color blindness, particularly conservative activists and legal strategists, they're really referring to this idea that color does not matter for access to opportunities. Color does not matter for your sort of life chances and outcomes. If we don't look at color, then racism will not exist, right? That's the sort of concept or the idea behind color blindness. I personally do not believe in color blindness, but I talk about it at length in the book because it is a dominant racial logic that's being deployed by conservatives during this period. And again, it really emerges from the ways that color blindness is written into the law in relationship to non-discrimination, right, with civil rights legislation, and the ways in which the sort of context and the intention around some of that legislation is sort of twisted with conservatives' appropriation of this idea of color blindness. And so for me in the book, I talk about it, both color blindness and diversity, right, as these sort of logics that are being used in these campaigns and various political struggles over affirmative action. So thank you for that question. Okay. Carol Riley asks, what has been your biggest learning as a result of your research? That is a really big question. I mean, I think so. One of the things that I learned is that I guess that I had more capacity and ability to sort of sit with being uncomfortable more than I thought I did. I say that because this was initially a dissertation that I revised into a book. And as a graduate student, I would have never thought that I was going to start a project that would have me combing through materials from conservative think tanks and, really sitting with the kinds of ideas and policies and practices that and sort of opinions on those policies and practices that would have really made me uncomfortable. I would have never thought that I would just be sitting there and doing that. I would have never thought. I basically had to. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer, but I had to sit with you know volumes of Supreme Court briefs, case briefs, follow things from district court to Supreme Court level. And so I had to learn a lot about the law through this process. So those are some things that I think I, definitely learned about from doing this. Let's see. Everyone's like, well, you've mentioned radical interventions and solutions. Multiple people have. So one of the radical interventions and solutions, since people are asking, for example, is what I've mentioned multiple times: no tuition, eliminating student debt. Those are radical interventions that I think we should take very seriously. And I think we have to sort of reimagine what the purpose of higher education is. Right? We all go to college because it's a credentialing, right, that's needed for the kinds of jobs that we want. What does that mean in an economy that is very unstable? What does that mean in an economy where, we're oftentimes producing more credentialed people than there are jobs? What does that mean? And that's what I mean about reimagining education. Maybe we need to be also doing other things in this space. Maybe producing a workforce is not the most important thing about going to college, right? I think everyone should have access to go to college. I think it's an incredibly important uh, space to think, to engage with people that you would have may have never been exposed to at any other point in your life.
Right.
An incredibly important time for personal development, for collective development, to really know yourself, to learn more about the world, right? I mean, there's so many benefits to higher education that are not about having the specific degree for a specific job. And I think if we really consider that, it can open us up for thinking and reimagining what this space is for and what it means to make this space more accessible, right? Why should only privileged and elite people have this space to, have that particular space for personal development, for thinking and reading and engaging? Everyone should have that opportunity. Everyone should have that space, right? So that's what I mean by sort of reimagining.
Right. Beautifully said.
Okay. Can you speak to affirmative actions impact, lack of impacts on faculty hiring? That's a good question. So in the book, I'm focused on the experience of students. But, as I mentioned earlier, right, if we go to, for example, on Twitter, the hashtag Black in the Ivory Tower conversation that's been happening over the past few days, a lot of what you can glean or learn from exploring that hashtag has been the sort of intense experience of discrimination, of exclusion, neglect, of the experience that Black faculty, Black graduate students who want to be faculty are regularly experiencing on a daily basis, and how that experience itself is actually, a lot of people are leaving the pipeline before they get to become faculty because of that, right? In regards to the role or the impact, in every state, that had ballot initiatives that ended affirmative action, it was not only in university admissions, but it was also in relationship to hiring, right? So admissions, hiring, and state contracting. Those are the three areas. So Proposition 209 hits those three areas. In the other states, Arizona, Michigan. I mean, there's a variety of states that have passed ballot initiatives that ended affirmative action. So that also impacted hiring in those places as well.
Mm-hmm. And Amaka, I would say here that the hashtag Black in the Ivory was one of the co-creators, is an AAUW fellowship alumna, Dr. Sharday Davis. So it's good to see, you know, that kind of activism and gathering everyone together, not just to share those experiences and shine a light on them, but think about, you know, what is the real change that needs to happen in the academy, you know.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. Okay, there's so many questions and I don't even know where to begin here. Let's see.
You know, we can't answer them all.
I know. Um, okay. My definition of elite. So when I'm referring to elite selective institutions, I'm talking about institutions that admit only a small percentage of the people that apply. The sheer majority of universities in this country admit the majority of students that apply. The institutions that I focused on in my book, of the 4 institutions, 3 of them I consider to be elite selective institutions. That is the University of California system, University of Michigan, and the University of Texas, Austin. These are either individual campuses or systems that are highly competitive and hard to get into. They are highly ranked, and there are spaces that reproduce the elite, right? These are spaces that governors go get their degrees from these spaces. Some very powerful people in their states and in this country attend these universities. And that's what I mean by elite spaces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Tuition and cost of education. Let's see. Yeah, someone says, what are my thoughts about reducing, capping, or offering free education? All for it. Intuition, eliminate student debt. Let's see. Do you think any decision about equity in education should start with better policies and better training for educators? Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, oftentimes when we're having these conversations about access to education, we're only focused on students. But I do think that we have to broaden our thinking, right? What does it mean for the faculty in the classroom, right? I'm a faculty member. I have never gone, and I've gone through many kinds of university trainings, right? We have to take them all the time, particularly being at a public institution, right? I have never gone through any faculty training that's about sort of, that's related to sort of pedagogy around, you know, including analysis of racism or discrimination in the curriculum. That's never been required. I've never been to a training that's about being, you know, creating more inclusive spaces for students. Never, right? And so I think we also absolutely should, you know, draw more attention to the role of faculty and staff, right, on campuses. So often when we think about universities, we're focused on the experience for the student, which is really important. Universities are often some of the biggest spaces of employment in communities and in particular states, right? So what does that mean? What are the kinds of hiring policies that are being enacted in these spaces? And what does that mean for sort of equity, fairness? You know, what does it mean, you know, if, for example, women of color faculty are not being paid comparable to their white male peers, right? What does that mean for an experience of inclusion and having, thinking of the campus as a workplace, which it is, right? The experience of contingent and adjunct faculty, right, and the sort of horrendous conditions that they're often dealing with on campuses across this country is one that we have to deal with, right? And having access to healthcare and some kind of stability. So these are all questions that we have to really wrestle with when we're thinking about um, sort of intervening and reimagining universities.
Absolutely. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay. Yeah, can you address the importance of community and technical colleges for access to excellent education and workforce skills development? So this was one of my points about sort of a broader understanding of the field of higher education, right? We have to think about the role of community colleges. We have to think about the role of these spaces as, um, having more, the average person in this country is likely having more face to face or sort of more experience with the community college as opposed to a University of Michigan, right? And so we have to think about what it means for community colleges if we're actually putting the sort of resources and the investment in those spaces, because they are important spaces, because they have so many different kinds of folks going through a community college. Some people just taking a class or two, some people going for formal credentialing or degrees, and some people passing through community colleges on their way to four-year universities.
Right.
So I absolutely think that we have to pay more attention to, making sure that our community colleges are strong and are, doing a good job at sort of bringing in students, and particularly in particular students of color.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Okechukwu. We know that there are lots of questions that are still out there to be answered, but I really appreciate you taking the time, really, to share your research and your book with us. More information, obviously, can be found in To Fulfill These Rights, the political struggle over affirmative action and open admissions. And, we certainly encourage folks who have been on the call to share this information. This webinar will be available afterwards on the AAUW website, so folks can definitely go back and take a look at it, and we encourage you to share it with folks in your network. I think that the conversation around equity in education, not just higher education, as you mentioned, we're talking about K through 12, is important, and the reimagining of education during a time when we're looking at really reimagining our society and so many other institutions. If this isn't the best time, I don't know when it's going to happen. And so I think that we really are, on the cusp of looking at some of that radical change that one of the folks mentioned in the question. And so if you just, wanted to say a few words before we close out.
Yeah, and thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone who attended. I apologize that I could not answer all your questions, but you can visit my website. You could reach out to me, via email, I'm on Twitter, PhD Amaka, to continue these kinds of conversations. And I can absolutely, if you're having this conversation with people in your community, I'd be happy to Zoom in or figure out some way to have more conversations with you. And I really do think that we are in a moment of possibility where so much more than we thought is possible. And I think that we have to really take advantage of that. And so we have to really think about what we want and what we want these institutions to be, what we want them to look like, and push for what we want right now. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Gloria. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And please make sure when you visit our website, check out the AAUW Equity Network, where we will continue to have these kinds of conversations. So thank you for joining us. And we look forward to the next webinar and seeing you soon.